So we're now ready to start the next topic, which will be focusing on the Mono class. If you recall, there are two key classes in Project Reactor, Flux and Mono. And Mono is the simpler of the two, so we're going to start with Mono first. So we're going to talk here about some of the key Mono operators, which you can read about in the Mono documentation at the bottom of the page. And we're going to start our discussion with a discussion of factor method operators, which are operators that create Mono objects in various ways. There's a bunch of different factor methods that are part of the Mono class. We're going to talk here about the just and from callable factor method operators. So we'll start with the just method. This is a very, very simple method that creates a new Mono that emits the specified item that's provided as a parameter. So the parameter for Mono is the one and only item that will be emitted via the onNext method. That's how you push things from publishers to subscribers through a chain of operators in Mono or Flux. Just returns the Mono containing the value that's emitted that's captured at instantiation time. This is kind of a weird concept. We'll talk about instantiation time, or sometimes called assembly time, which is different from runtime. So what this means, and it won't make much sense at first, but when we talk about concurrency later, it'll make a lot more sense. Just is what's referred to as an eager operator. And therefore, just always runs in the context of the thread where the assembly is performed. And you probably don't quite know what an assembly is yet, but assembly basically is the sequence of calls that are made on a Mono to perform operations on it. And we'll look at some examples here in just a second. Keep these semantics, these eager semantics in mind when we talk about the subscribe on operator here shortly. This will also show a bit about what an assembly is as well. So here's an example that shows how just can be used in practice. This factor method adapts non-reactive input sources, like in this case, giving a reduced big fraction, and it adapts it to work with the reactive model. You probably remember what the adapter pattern is. The adapter pattern is a gang of four pattern you hopefully learned about in CS 251, and it basically can be used to let things work together that maybe weren't designed initially to work together. So here's a case where we have the big fraction reduce method, which is not the same thing as the reduce method in streams or other functional frameworks. It just takes an unreduced fraction and reduces it. And we take that reduced fraction, and that value is captured eagerly at instantiation time. In other words, when this code is compiled, that particular call is going to be made at assembly time. It's going to take the value at assembly time. And that will be the value that's returned for all subscribers to this Mono. Now, most of the examples we're going to look at just has one subscriber, but be aware you could have multiple subscribers. RxJava, which is an alternative framework for reactive streams, has a very similar method called just, which works exactly the same way. In this case, you say single.just, because single is kind of the equivalent of Mono in RxJava. And once again, you give it the reduced big fraction. So that's just. Just is very, very simple. There's another operator that is similar in terms of creating stuff. It's a factor method, but it has slightly different semantics, and it's kind of fun to compare and contrast those two operators. So the fromCallable operator is also a factor method that creates a Mono of type T, and the Mono's value is produced using the provided callable supplier. That's why the name of this factor method is fromCallable, because you give it a callable supplier and it goes ahead and it calls it. The Mono that's emitted here is returned by the supplier callable at runtime, not at instantiation time or assembly time. It happens at runtime. And so the way to look at that is it's lazy. Remember we talked about how just was eager, which meant it did it earlier. It always called that method to get the result, and that became the value that was emitted by the Mono. That's what just does, and every subscriber gets the same value. Well, in contrast, fromCallable is lazy, and we'll see what that means in a second. But again, keep these semantics in mind when we talk later about the subscribe on method. Once again, fromCallable is a factory method that will adapt non-reactive input sources into the reactive model. So here we've got an example where we're going to use fromCallable to reduce a big fraction. And it looks similar at first to what we saw before with just. The difference is that fromCallable is lazy. And what that means is that every time it's invoked, it will go ahead and call the callable parameter at runtime. And you could get different results for each subscriber that would subscribe. Now, in this particular case, you're going to get the same result because we're just saying, big fraction, reduce, unreduced big fraction. So it's not a big deal. You won't see much difference. But there could be situations where you would get different results. For example, if instead of saying big fraction dot reduce unreduced fraction, we said random number generator generate big fraction or some call like that, then every time that fromCallable was called, it would return a different big fraction, which is different from what we saw with mono.just. There's a fromCallable operator that's part of RxJava's single class that works exactly the same way. So it does it in a lazy manner. Now, this lazy manner may seem a little bit esoteric at the moment, and I agree it is at the moment, but when we get into the concurrency discussions later, you'll see why it's very important. So that's the end of the discussion of factory method operators in the Mono class. We will come back later and show how to use these things in a more complete example. But for now, this is just a way to get things started. These are the very, very, very simplest operators that you can use to give values to monos. And we'll talk shortly about what you can do once you've got a value in a mono, all the interesting things you can do with it.